being kind is doing things, even if it may feel uncomfortable, to get to the right result and to do what's fair and what's right for people. Like that is the kind thing, even if it doesn't feel nice, like that's what's right to do in the end.
Welcome to the Kindness Is podcast, where we take a deep dive into the true meaning of kindness. I'm your host, Kaitlin Johnstone, the co-founder of Kind Cotton. Let's dive in. Throughout my years of being on social media, there have been so many people who I have grown to love and appreciate more than I could have ever imagined starting an Instagram account. And my guest this week is one of those people. I am so grateful that Naomi exists in this incredibly complicated and chaotic world because she brings such an immense light to it. I hope you enjoy our conversation this week on the Kindness Is pod. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Kindness Is pod. Today I have Naomi, which I am super excited about. She is a wife, mom, author, creator, presenter, and educator who currently lives in LA. She enjoys using her creative skills to teach students how to read and help caregivers and other educators teach important lessons to children. Naomi, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here and I can't wait for this conversation.
Me too. You know, I don't know that you even know this, but I have been following your journey for years now. I mean, I know you know that because we've been connected for years, but I think you were one of the first of like 20 people I ever even followed on Instagram. And it's just really beautiful to see all that you have done over the past, I'd say 6, 7 years. So I'm happy to chat about it.
Yeah, I'm excited too. It's funny to look back and say like, wow, I've been doing this for a really long time now. And I've built this body of work and built this following and put these ideas out into the world and really made this impact when back in the day you were like, it's just little old me trying to do my tiny part. And then you look at how far you've come. It's really cool feeling.
I think of that all the time, particularly when I'm in these ruts. If it's either like a slow season or I don't know, we all feel all of the feelings all the time, right? And then I imagine back to when I was walking one order a day, like out to my mailbox and being filled with so much pride that it was mine and it was something that I did. And then I'm like, wow, now I can host like these free book fairs. So it's a really beautiful thing to like look back and reflect. I get that. So tell us a little bit about, there's so many things that you do and so many things that you are passionate about. And there's a ton of reasons as to why I love all that you do. So can you take a moment and tell us particularly why education has always been so inspiring for you?
It's inspiring for me because it's just something I feel like you can give to people that nobody can take away. And it can just literally change their lives. Like when I'm, speaking particularly about young students and in the communities that I've often worked in, it's like, once I give you these skills, no one can take that from you. And you can then use these skills and do so much more with them. So just being able to empower young students with information or the ability to read, write, do math, think in certain ways, knowing that they can now take that and make something of it. And like, they're going to carry this with them for the rest of their lives. And that's what's going to help them survive and navigate this world. It's just like, it's such a privilege and an honor to be able to do that. And just definitely something I've never taken lightly.
I love that. And I feel like you shared a story last year about literacy, particularly in the school that you were teaching at, and a bunch of people being like shocked at your literacy scores.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit about that and why like reading is so powerful and why you are so passionate about that particularly? And, maybe as to why your scores are always high.
Yes. I mean, like I'm read like a rock star for a reason. I think it was partly luck, but also a lot of research and hard work going into the craft of it. But just even from my first year of teaching, there were just teacher moves that I was making. And there was stuff in the curriculum. It was, what was it called? Imagine It Reading was the curriculum. And there was this section that the veteran teachers told me to skip. They were like, don't worry about that section. We always skip it. Your kids don't need it. They wanted to focus on memorizing sight words. And actually reading the kids' books, because in their minds, that is what was going to get kids reading. But because I was new, I was too afraid to skip the green section, which was
Mhm.
actually the phonics and phonemic awareness, which is what kids need the most. All of this science of reading is coming out, and it's nothing new, but I feel like it's this new buzzword right now.
Yeah.
Finally, people are putting some respect on the value of phonics and phonemic awareness. And it was something that I always did from my first year. And so even that first year, when my scores as a new teacher were higher than other people's, in my mind, I was like, it was that green section.
Yeah.
So that kind of like lit that fire under me. Whereas my coworkers were like, oh, you must have gotten lucky, or you must have just had a really good batch of kids, or you just got the high class this year. But then I did it again my second year, and I did it again my third year. And then even when I moved to Denver for 6 years there, I was consistently getting the highest scores. So I began looking into this because I kind of bought into that, like, oh, maybe it is kind of luck. Maybe I did get these
Mm,
kids. But then I was like, no, I'm doing this on purpose. Like year 4 and year 5, I was like, it's the phonics, it's the phonemic awareness, it's the way that I progress over the year, it's the relationships we have even that make them, pay attention. It's the way that I'm engaging that makes them focus, and the pictures that I add, just so many little things that I put into my instruction, that I was like, no, I'm doing this on purpose. I know what I'm doing. And because I would always want to defend myself, I would start researching stuff or reading books. So I could be like, no, I didn't get lucky. I did this on purpose because here's what research says
yeah,
about
yeah.
and here's what research says about phonemic awareness and vocabulary and background knowledge. And then I just got to the point where I'm like, no, I know what I'm talking about. I can be the authority on this because I've done it for now 7 years in a row. And I'm going to keep doing it for 4 more years. I just finished my 11th year in the classroom. So even at this new school, I was back to being brand new again. It's a school that historically has really low scores. They unfortunately came to expect low scores. A lot of the students were newcomers to the country. So there was the excuse that, oh, well, English is not their first language. So of course their scores are this low. I'm like, I don't care what language they speak. I'm going to get them to read, and I'm going to use that language, their home language, to their advantage. Instead of thinking it as a negative thing, it's a positive thing. It's wonderful. Bring their culture into the classroom, bring their language into the classroom. And I bet you I can still get these scores up. And I did. And it wasn't until probably around this time last year, like February, when we did our second round of testing and their scores just shot up, that finally people were like, oh, we should be paying attention to what she's doing. Because I had asked about teaching a reading PD because I saw kind of the excuses. I saw the kids and I was like, I bet I could get their kids on track. And I was like, if I give them this training, I was like, I do this for, a reading conference. I present on science of reading all the time. And I think just being newer, they were like, oh, she thinks she can help.
Hmm.
And once they saw my scores, they were like, oh, what are you doing? Like, we got to start doing this in the rest of our classrooms. And then they kind of started to try to implement some of the stuff and start coming to my classroom to like watch how I ran small group and whole group to try to start making a difference with their classes.
I'm happy they were receptive to it. Like
Me too.
that's a great thing to hear because listen, I've been in the situation where when I first went to kindergarten at the last school I was teaching in, they were still doing a wildly inappropriate holidays around the world celebration, like that was very not appreciating other countries, but appropriating. And
Yeah.
I went in a blazing, like first year, and was like, I am not doing this. And I brought like all of the information as to why this was inappropriate, as to why we weren't actually engaging the children who were in our classroom in their own cultures.
Yeah.
And so I rewrote the whole script and I focused on the kids in my classroom, right? And we learned about their cultures and it was awesome. It was just much more informational and there were no costumes and all of these things that should not be included. And I think there was maybe one other teacher who followed suit. It has changed a little bit more now. Like we're going back, this was about 6 years ago.
Mhm.
So I'm happy to see that it took some time, but people slowly kind of moved away from it. But I'm really happy to hear that they followed along and listened.
I mean, I feel like with the data like that, because we'd go to data meetings
Yeah.
and their little bar graphs are down here and mine's like up here. And I was in second grade. So I go to the K-2 data meetings. And so they know these kids. You taught this kid in second grade. You taught
Yes.
last year and they can't read. They can't learn. This kid, they just won't get it. And now you see them at a blue level, at a green level, above grade level. So you kind of have to pay attention to it because don't get me wrong, there's definitely other things at the school. Like I'm trying to get rid of Dr. Seuss that they
Same.
couldn't let go of. So there's always a fight somewhere. Literacy, I won that one, but other battles, I definitely did not.
And that probably speaks to the nature of our world, which I think is an important question to ask you about. You touched on a couple of things: relationships, cultural responsive teaching, all of these things that I think are really important. And then you said you lost the battle when it comes to Dr. Seuss. So I'm wondering why you think it is so important to understand the children who are in your classroom, to bring their cultures into the classroom. That, in and of itself is practicing kindness. And I think you're going to get further
Mhm.
with anyone, right? It's like what we say all the time: when you can see yourself in a book, you're going to be more engaged in that book. So can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I think part of that is even the mindset of the adult. If you are an adult that sees the value in bringing your students' cultures in the classroom, then you are probably someone that's looking at their culture as an asset. You are thinking about their language as an asset, and you are willing to make changes to your practice, not just necessarily do things the way they've always been done,
Mm,
because you are someone that values culture. I think the minute that you're not ready to make certain changes, you kind of already show me that you're someone that could have that deficit mindset around when somebody entered the country, what language they speak at home, and that you're already having these biases against them. You probably already have lower expectations. So even just knowing that you're someone that embraces other people's cultures and you see the value in it instead of just forcing them to conform or assimilate or thinking that's what's best. Because I don't think teachers are necessarily these mean people out here saying, like, I don't want to do this because I'm a bad person. They think they're doing what's best for kids. So even that mindset shift has to happen, because if you
mhm.
think forcing them to assimilate to your culture and that your culture is the best way to do things instead of bringing their stuff in to the classroom as well and seeing that as a positive, you're already like, not doing the right thing, because you're already working with this like negative bias and having low expectations and not valuing them for who they are and hoping that they changed into a student like you, or like maybe the way that you were brought up or the way that you had education taught to you, and thinking that's like the only way and the best way to do it. So it's just so important to like make sure that mindset shift is there, because then the other stuff comes easily. Like you get an idea and you don't mind embracing something or changing something when your mindset is in the place to be accepting.
Yeah, I feel like we get so used to, particularly in education, just the way of doing things, right? And traditions. Like,
Yes.
people have a hard time,
Mhm.
regardless of if it's in the classroom, outside of the classroom. When my own personal family started doing Thanksgiving differently, right?
Yeah.
Like when we started having these conversations surrounding, you know, actual Thanksgiving and actual history. And we can still get together and like be with family, but let's also spend our time divesting in certain systems and putting our money other places and maybe watching this documentary and having real conversations. It was a huge mindset shift, even for people who are like willing to engage in that. Um, since you brought up Dr. Seuss, and that's something that we've talked about for a long time too, can you explain the difference? Because I now, with all of the current book bans that are happening that are extremely dangerous, get asked all of the time, well, you're okay with people not doing Dr. Seuss books anymore. Why are you not okay? And so angry and loud about the fact that people can't read a story about Heather having two mommies. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, I think like it's quite like I get the argument. I'm like, okay, I see what you were trying to do there.
Yeah.
But when it's like the answer is because of racism, then I
Hmm.
feel like that's where the explanation needs to stop. There was LeVar Burton. I had the chance to meet LeVar Burton last summer at a conference, and he gave a speech. And in it, he said, every book isn't for everybody, but there is somebody for every book. And it was like, yes. And
Hmm.
I think it's not like, oh, ban Dr. Seuss from schools, but it's like for me, I'm like, especially when it's older kids that can make more informed decisions, teach them the truth and then give them the
Hmm.
choice. Like that's something I even did in my first grade classroom, where we learned about the racist images and the things that he did in his life. And it's like, so let's have a debate. Do we want these books in our classroom? Yes or no?
Hmm.
Unanimously decided that they didn't want them. So it's not like kick it out of the school. It's just making a choice. And that's the thing. It's not banning all of the books. It's letting people make informed choices about what they want to read and what they don't want to read, but just completely having it not as an option when the reason isn't rooted in like racism or just something that's completely awful going on. I feel like that is the difference. Like their reasoning for not wanting certain things is because of homophobia or sexism or being racist, and it's just not quite the same as like, well, I don't like that, or I just don't agree with that. And it's like, well, this, like, it's just not, the same for me. It's like, it's just not even the same argument whatsoever. Like our reasons are not the same and don't hold the same value.
Yeah, for sure. And something that I mentioned all the time too was I didn't personally purchase any Dr. Seuss books for my classroom. I got rid of the ones that I had prior in my own home. I didn't want, I even had on my, I don't know that I've ever shared this on a podcast, but my mom made my invitations for my baby shower and was like, in lieu of gifts or in lieu of cards, please bring a children's book. And there was like a little note at the bottom that was like, please do not purchase Dr. Seuss books. And that's in my own home, right? Like there's a very big difference. My students would bring in, Seuss books for their independent reading time all the time. And I would never be like, oh my goodness, you cannot have that here. Like,
Right.
And that is the danger in it. So I'm happy that you addressed that.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I have learned from you, have an incredible resource that you put out, is the importance of talking to your children, particularly white children, at a young age about race. And I think this is something that particularly white moms get all nervous about and uncomfortable about, and they don't know how to approach it. First of all, books are an incredible tool. Like if you don't know where to start, like get a picture book. Google is your best friend. But you also have this amazing resource, and I want to know why it is so important for all families to talk to their children about race.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's so well researched. I even just before we got on, I was like, let me double check these numbers in this research. But even like at 6 months of age, babies recognize different races. By 2, they really start to notice different features and like hair and skin and just other things. By 3, they will make choices based on race. And by 5 years old, kids can hold the same racial attitudes as adults. What was also really cool in that research, I think it came out of Yale, was that in as little as a week, having these really direct and open conversations can improve those racial attitudes with kids that are 5 to 6 years old. So it's like, you got to get them while they're young, and then you don't have decades and decades of things to undo later when they've already formed certain stereotypes and biases against people just based on what they see in society. And then I think it's so true with parents, and particularly white parents, that are nervous about talking about race. I think they think that is the thing that's going to make their kid pay attention to race and become racist. And it's like, it's the opposite. We're not talking about it, and making it this taboo thing is what makes them think that race is bad. And then they always equate that to color. Like I have been places where little small, like 3, 4, 5-year-old will say like, oh, she's brown. And their parent is immediately embarrassed and mortified and like, be quiet, like a simple, yes, she is brown. Isn't that beautiful? Would just do and keep it moving, right? But then to be like, oh my gosh, hush, be quiet, makes it seem like, oh my gosh, I said something wrong. It must be wrong to be brown. And then if every time they're hushed or they're told to be quiet or the parent is embarrassed and like apologizing for your child noticing something true about me, makes them think, oh, it must be bad to be Black, and it's bad to talk about Black people or to Black people. And their questions and their noticings don't go away. They just learn not to voice them to you anymore. So then now that's dangerous because they're making their own assumptions instead of asking a trusted adult that can guide them. And just for like a little guidance with that, I always say, and I did it with my own children who are biracial but present as Black, to start out with diversity as being beautiful and point out differences and like the way people are dressed, like, oh, that's a hijab. Oh my gosh, that looks so pretty, that covering on her head. Or, oh my gosh, look at the skin color. Look at those curls. Look at this and that, and all sorts of skin colors and body types and disabilities, and just pointing it out in that way, not from a negative standpoint at all. Like I'm always like, start out with a highlight reel And then later you can talk about, did you know sometimes people face discrimination for this thing? Like
Mhm.
they're a little bit older, so that they're not, the first thing that they're not hearing is like slavery, racism, like all this horrible stuff. But like with little kids, just point it out. Like, yeah, this is different, and different doesn't mean weird. Different doesn't mean less. It's beautiful. It's so cool. Like everything would be boring if it was all the same. And just making sure they have that messaging as a solid foundation when they are 3, 4, and 5. And then later on, you can get into the things because they can handle it and their brains are a little bit more developed to discuss, discrimination or bias, and how they can be, a part of the solution. I can even think of in preschool, like I've worked in preschool, I worked in daycare, or just working at a school, and there are preschoolers. There's been issues with little kids that don't want to sit next to somebody else because they don't have the same eye color as them, or because they
Mhm.
are brown, or they think it's dirty. So it's like we have little kids experiencing that at a young age. So like they're forced to learn about it because they're living it. We can have other kids learn about it so that they don't inadvertently, do this to other children, and like their teachable moment is someone else's traumatic moment. Like I don't have a Black friend that doesn't have a story from kindergarten where somebody made them feel less than or othered, and that kid wasn't trying to be racist,
Yeah, yeah.
even know what that was, but it could have been avoided had they been given, some lessons or told that different is beautiful, from day one, instead of them making, negative assumptions.
Yeah, that's amazing. I have so many thoughts surrounding that just with my own daughter, right? Because she just turned 4 and we've been doing those things very actively from the time she was a baby. I mean,
Mhm.
just in the books that she read, in well, once we were locked out of isolation. As you know, we lived very isolated for a long time. But the people who we were around, just the conversations that we would have. And today, when I was like, it's Black History Month. So we're recording this on February 1st for anyone who is listening. And she was just like, oh, well, why don't we have a peach history month? Because like she calls her skin color peach.
Yeah.
And then I was like, that's a really good question. Well, Mama has explained to you before that everyone is beautiful and there are differences and uniquenesses, but I've also read some books to you when people have faced discrimination, right? And like she knows what that means. And I said, so that's why it's so much more important that we have an entire month to celebrate. I know that you get these books all of the time, right? And she sees things such as like
Mhm.
Black joy and not just the awful things.
Yes.
But she's also read stuff like your book. It's an amazing conversation starter, right?
Yeah.
Even at a young age. And she knows that Micah, the character in your book, had faced some terrible things in school and some questions in school due to the color of his skin. So I tried explaining in the most age appropriate way that she could wrap her little brain around why we only have a Black History Month. Not
Yeah.
only, but I mean in comparison to a White
Yeah.
History Month. And she was just like, oh yeah. And then I started explaining to her, like, you also see your skin everywhere. Maybe not in our house because Mama does a very good job of like trying for it to not be that.
That's
But
not how
think
the
about
world is.
think about the Disney princesses. Yeah. Think about the skin that you see all the time. And she was like, yeah. I'm like, do you have any questions? And she was like, can I read a new book? I'm like, yeah. Like,
And
but
I
they
think
get
that's
it.
great that you do that. And that's the other part of it, is when you have certain conversations, it makes other ones easier. I know so many teachers that get stressed out because they've been teaching, happiness and joy and all like the fun picture
Mm,
books from August to January. And then suddenly they have to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. And
yeah.
they're, oh my gosh, I can't do this. This is so hard. It's like, but if you'd been having conversations all year long, this is just another conversation. This is just another lesson that, adds further context to other stuff you've discussed. And like when you have those conversations, like maybe the first few might be hard and they might have some really big feelings, but then when you're just adding to it, when you just have to say, remember, we already talked about this, this is another example of that. Then it's like, oh, okay. And you're just building their background knowledge, for exactly what was going on. And if they've been having certain conversations, then they can just better understand other situations, when they happen. And you can say, remember that book that we read? This is that happening, or, oh, this is just like that, or this is discrimination. This is what I talked about. But when you save it all until the big racist incident happens, and then
Hmm.
you suddenly have to burst their bubble and try to explain, years of history and this and that. And then they're like, wait, what? And then there's people that just don't want to go there. So you avoid it. And then that
Mhm.
just, these kids grow up, they've never had these stories. They think other people are just playing the victim, or they don't really understand what's going on, or they think it's made up because no one that they know and trust has ever brought it to their attention. If they aren't in the right community, they don't have friends that have ever taught them anything or anything they've seen with their own eyes. And they truly think it's not the issue that it is because it's been avoided or tiptoed around their whole lives.
Yeah, for sure. I was just explaining on a podcast yesterday that in the district that I used to teach in, there was a passage about Martin Luther King pulled from schools, which leads me to my next question of, and you answered this a little bit already, but you are also very, very passionate about history. And I want to know why teaching accurate history and standing up against this harmful legislation and using our voices to ensure that children are getting that strong basis of what actually has happened in our past is so crucial.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many reasons, but I think one of those reasons being that when you again are trying to share historical stories, like other historical events that happened before that matter. This won't make sense unless you know this story, and
Mm,
this won't make sense unless you know this story, and even just stuff going on present day. Like there's just so many things that you're like, why is this a thing? And you look it up, and it's always tied to racism, or it always came
mhm,
from some racist beginning. And you're like, oh, wow, that's why this is a thing. Of course, this is a thing. Like I think about people having such an issue with Confederate monuments, like going down, coming down. But when you research about like why they went up in the first place, or why they're even there, who put them there, who fought to get them there, what they really stood for, um, I would like to think that with a little bit more knowledge, certain people would be like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. Like they're walking around thinking like, well, this is my forefathers and the founding fathers did this and sacrificed so much. And when you don't have the full and accurate picture, it's easy to feel like something so pure and wholesome is being attacked and how dare they? But really, you never had the full story to begin with. So I can see why you might feel like that. And then by the time you're an adult and you might be set in your ways and you're unwilling to hear the truth, it's just a really hard reality pill to swallow. So it's like the earlier the better. And if they can grow up having these nuanced discussions and these debates about history and getting all the facts and making sense of them, then they won't be these adults that think that they're just under attack instead of really understanding
mhm.
the historical aspect of everything, you know, going on. And then it's just important. And then even for me, as I even learn truths, like I'm here like, oh my gosh, why was I making Christopher Columbus crafts when I was little? And I'm like, did my teacher know the truth and we just did this anyway? Because it's like, why is this person being celebrated? Who
Yeah.
celebrated instead? Or why didn't we just know the truth from the start and get the whole story? Like, yes, he did all of this stuff, and he also came and did horrible things to people. So why does he have a holiday? Like it just leads you to just question so many things. And I feel like we owe it to kids to give them that full picture and allow them to make their own decisions of like, well, I think this outweighs that. And I still think there should be a Columbus Day. Because even in like we have a Columbus unit, the last question is, so what do you think? Should we still celebrate
Mm.
this day or not? It's not telling kids what to think, but it's just giving them the information and allowing them to make informed decisions. And when we don't give them the full picture, they can't make informed decisions.
I love that you do that because it allows for critical thinking. And I think right now, I mean, I say all the time that please, people, like, stop saying that we're leading down the road and the path of fascism. Like, it is alive and well.
Yeah.
Please, please, if you are hearing this, understand that we are already in the midst of it. And I think one of the key components of that is doing away with critical thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whitewashing history, banning books, doing away with all of these things that enable children to formulate their own thoughts and opinions surrounding things. So I love that you're not doing away with it for your quote unquote, and I'm saying this as what people on the other side of things may say, like your radical woke agenda or something, right? Like you're
Yes.
still leaving it in there and saying, now I want you to tell me what you think. You're not just completely erasing it the way in which people are taking books away and, you
Right.
know, taking all of these ideas and thoughts away from children so that they're made to think a certain way. So I think that's amazing that you added that part in. Can you tell everyone where they can get all of the things. I mean, Naomi is a wealth of knowledge, friends. She has reading stuff. She has history lessons, all of the things. Where can people support you?
So I have my website, which is readlikearockstarteaching.com, where I have individual resources, so many reading resources, social studies lines with my teaching friend, Lanisha Tab. And then I also have a Science of Reading aligned membership, because I would just like post what I was doing in my classroom and people would be like, can you send me this? And I'm like, well, I can't, because it's systematic phonics. So you have to follow the order that I followed, or your kids aren't going to be at this level. So I created this membership with 46 weeks worth of lessons. And that is if you go to bit.ly/phonics time. And then also at tabandO'Brien.com, Lanisha and I made a social studies club, because we started this work. We really just wanted to bring culturally responsive lessons into our classroom, or just untold stories even. Like, we're like, okay, we're tired of hearing about Martin, Rosa, Jackie, and Ruby. Like, they're great, but like, what else can we teach our kids, especially as a second grade teacher? By the time they come to me, they've done MLK and K and one. I'm like, who else can I teach you about? So we just wanted to tell untold stories, and then tell the other stories that are usually around the right way. And that's, if you go to tabandO'Brien.com, we have a social studies club where we cover all the cultural months, all the holidays, not just American holidays. And we just really try to continue to grow that library and include as much as possible, especially when we get a student that we're like, oh my gosh, the student's culture is not represented. Like, let's make a lesson about that ties to Bulgaria, that ties to Vietnam, or that ties to wherever that student in our class is from, to just continue to build that library. We're like, we're not going to ever be able to include everybody and get it right, but we're always going to try.
And it's amazing. I mean, that's what I used when I taught social studies in my kindergarten classroom. And I honestly, you do feel kind of angry. I learned history as an adult. Like, I did not know. And honestly, I mean, I think a big part of growing and becoming a more kind human, like actual kindness, is admitting that you've messed up. Like, my first 1 to 2 years of teaching, I was guilty of those things because I didn't know. Like, I didn't know the accurate history. I did the things that, other teachers showed me to do. I did their lessons because as a first year teacher, I didn't have any time to like do anything else. I followed the curriculum. And then as I started learning and growing, I was like, this is really messed up.
Yeah. And you don't know, but I think once you know better, like Maya Angelou, you do have that obligation to do better. And that's all we do, is do better once you know better.
Yeah. And that's a perfect lead into what I ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, if you could redefine kindness in any way, or you could just share with us what your definition of kindness is, what would it be?
I always say that kindness is justice. Like, being nice is just going along to get along, but being kind is doing things even if it may feel uncomfortable, to get to the right result and to do what's fair and what's right for people. Like, that is the kind thing, even if it doesn't feel nice. Like, that's what's right to do in the end.
Thank you. I couldn't agree anymore. Naomi, you are such a blessing, such a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Kindness Is podcast. If you love it and it's adding even a little bit of value to your life, we would love, love, love if you could subscribe, rate, and review so we can reach even more people and make this world a little bit more kind.